As you can see from the screen here, we are going to be here for emotional first aid training. My name's Julie. I'm going to be your facilitator today. I am St. John Ambulance's National Office Facilitation Lead for our emotional first aid program. I'll tell you a little bit about the program as we go through, but for today, our session length is going to be about 75 minutes. So we have 75 minutes, just over an hour of content, and then we're going to have a question period at the end. Keep in mind, this training is a condensed training of our normal course offering. Our normal course offering will be about 3.5 hours long. It is a completely free and virtual training aimed at peers and frontline workers, specifically those who are responding to the frontline and substance use crisis. So thank you everyone for joining us today, presented by us, St. John Ambulance, Ambulance Saint Jean. A little bit about me, kind of before we get into it. I am a social work graduate. I have a criminology degree with a specialization in drug lens and drug policy. I spent the last 10 years doing frontline work in addictions and crisis, but most notably in overdose response. So that's where a little bit of my experience comes from and where this program was born from ultimately. It started out of our opioid poisoning response training program. So this was a program dedicated to teaching folks how to respond to a drug overdose or an opioid poisoning. In that, we had a self-care module at the end. It was dedicated to what happens when we get the result that we don't want, right? Where maybe we are responding to a crisis and it doesn't turn out the way that we were hoping. And how do we take care of ourselves in the aftermath of maybe a traumatic event or an opioid poisoning emergency? I'm very connected to this project personally. I was a help writer of the grant that we got accepted. It's a 4-year funded Health Canada program under the Substance Use and Addiction Programming. And it grew out of the modules that we had from before, because what we had heard from folks that were in the front line, folks that were taking our training, was that they were saying this was a crucial part of what's missing when you're starting out in the workforce, when you don't know the types of occupational hazards that you might face, right? And how to deal with it every day. So our hope really here by the end of today is that you're going to be more equipped to handle some of the challenges that come with being in a helping role. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, your reflections, your feedback. Ultimately, we're a program that's dedicated to user experience and making sure folks have the best experience that they can coming to our training. We don't want to waste anybody's time, right? We all are aware of the time constraints that can be placed on us as frontline workers. And so we want to make sure that you're leaving with something that's very, very tangible. So that's where this training is kind of going to come with some of the tools. To open us up here, we like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So before we begin, just acknowledging that St. John Ambulance's national office is located on the unceded Algonquin territory of the Anishinaabe. We want to acknowledge and thank the traditional owners of the land and all over Turtle Island. We also recognize the ongoing traumatic legacy of settler colonialism. This has created a disproportionate impact on inequity that we see today. For example, I'm from Alberta. I'm based in Edmonton. That's Treaty 6 territory, right? The ancestral land of the Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and the Métis Nation of Alberta. In Alberta, Indigenous folks are 8 times more likely to die from an unsafe drug poisoning and a toxic supply than non-Indigenous folks. This is a startling statistic, right? Across Turtle Island, many communities are facing an emergency due to the toxic drug crisis. So it's important that, we as participants, we as entities, we as organizations reflect on this reality. And I would encourage everyone to visit whos.land and learn more about the territory that you live, that you work in, us here on the unceded territory in Montreal, and understanding how that colonialism will contribute to affecting a nationwide crisis like we're facing right now. And it's giving us an important step forward in providing compassionate and informed care, something that I personally and us as this program are very, very passionate about. So we'll start off with a little bit of a thank you. Here is some photos that we've submitted from our peer advisory committee. This program was really created with the help of 9 individuals from all across Canada, all currently working or have worked in frontline or peer roles, all with lived or living experience of substance use, being people with lived or living experience, some from urban centers, some from, who are working in smaller remote communities. We also have over 100 program partners, so that is a very exciting time for us. I will introduce you to my colleague Chanel in the back. Everyone wave to Chanel. Hi, Chanel. Chanel is our outreach specialist, and she has done a wonderful job of making this a program that people would want to partner with. So if you are interested in partnering with us, please feel free to scan the QR code on the little sheet that you were given. It'll give you a list of information. You can access our wait list, our programming, and you can connect with us. Similarly, if you would like to receive a certificate out of this training, we offer certificates. So what we ask of you, though, is because the attendance isn't registered anywhere, this is a first come, first serve session, that you scan the QR code and then you email us saying, hey, this is my name, I attended this session, and we'll make you up a certificate and send it to you. Yeah, so Miigwech, thank you so much to our partners. A bit about what we're going to be exploring today. So you can see here on the slides, right, we have a little bit of housekeeping. So exits, bathrooms, washrooms, go ahead as you need. You don't need to worry about, asking or anything like that. For me, all good. We're going to be talking about some of the hard parts of the work, right? So maybe grief, trauma, no slime. We also have a pre-training survey here on the screen. So if you want to take it now, it's very helpful for us. It'll help us to report our outcomes back to the government. So telling us, hey, this is where folks were at when we started the training, and this was what folks were at the end of the training. So we have a QR at the end that you can scan as well. Provide us with some feedback. We love honest and brutal feedback. We are not a team that's precious about feedback, so let us know. Ultimately, what I like to close on here is that anything that's shared, we like to keep confidential, right? Within reason, there are things that we can't keep confidential, like harms to yourself, harms to others. But overall, stories, things shared in this room will remain confidential. All of the slides and resources that we're going to be talking about today and referencing are available on the app that you all have, so on that portal. We might be discussing some sensitive topics today. So things that might come up, you might find yourself feeling overwhelmed. It's totally okay, right? Feel free to take a break. You want to be honoring where you're coming from today. Don't put yourself in harm's way for the sake of sitting through a session if you're going to have a negative outcome at the end of it. So please be reflective and honor yourselves. It's not gonna, no harm, no foul for us, right? Things that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about topic 1, the occupational hazards of helping work. This is a module that I'm particularly fond of because I think sometimes that can go overlooked in the work that we do, where we think of occupational hazards, right, as maybe trade specific or other job specific, right? We can think of like falling off a ladder, but there are very real occupational harms that affect us as frontline workers that we want to talk about. We want to be, bringing light to that. We're also going to go through some self-reflection, some challenging stigma, and how that relates to mental resilience and wellness. We're also going to talk about balancing boundaries with community and mutual support, having a boundary conversation. We're going to talk about coping with grief and loss. So this is one of our more triggering topics. This is a topic that you might find yourself having some of those hard feelings. So just a fair warning here. And at the end, we really like to wrap it up with some practical strategies for surviving and thriving. So this is where we're going to talk about some tools and some of the tangible things that you can leave here with that you could walk out of here today and do low lift within an hour. Yeah. Well, if you have any questions throughout the training, you can save them till the end. We're going to have a question period. But if it's burning and you really need to know, put your hand up, right? I'm all good with that. We can answer them. All right. So we'll get into the topic of occupational harm and of helping work. So I'd invite everybody to start off right now with a somatic grounding exercise. So this is what we would call a trauma-informed body scan. It's one of the tools that you're going to be leaving here with today. It's an exercise that can be done whenever we might feel we need to be more grounded, more present, right? It can help when we're moving from one activity to the next, right? When we're in a really busy setting and we're coming to a space where we're transitioning our attention and our focus. I want you to think, what do I need, right now? Is it too bright? Is it too hot, too cold? Are you hungry, right? Do you need some water? Offer yourself that comfort and that care by attending to what you need as we begin, right? This is going to put you in a headspace where we're more able to absorb the information that's coming to us. This is a tool that's applicable in our everyday lives when we might face situations like this that are, taking our attention in multiple times, and we really just need to check in with ourselves. This is going to create a good foundation with us today. I want to start off by saying, of course, there are harms in this work that something like this is never going to be able to repair, right? But these are little pathways, little pebbles on the steps to healing, right? So occupational hazards, we talked about it a little bit at the top here, but all jobs come with occupational hazards, come with risks, right? Trauma-exposed roles, oftentimes like the ones that peers and frontline workers end up doing, will carry unique physiological and emotional hazards that demand attention, right? Understanding them and how we can alter our support strategies is going to help us to combating these different occupational harms. For example, right, the strategies for burnout, like we can see on the screen, are very different from the strategies for combating compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, right? These are all very different, and there are definitely some overlap, but knowing what they are is the first step of being able to kind of face some of these problems. So what is burnout? Well, burnout is when we have, in this case, workplace specific stressors, possibly rate of pay, right? Undesirable tasks, maybe poor working conditions, long hours, things that can accumulate and then become too much to handle. You may start feeling cynical, resentful, helpless, right? You may find yourself thinking, my job is so draining and there's nothing I can do to make it better. Anybody in any job can experience burnout. The important thing to remember with peer and frontline roles is that we are at a higher compounding risk for things like burnout because of the nature of the work that we do. So what can help? What are some of the things that we can do to address some of these factors that are creating this burnout in our lives? Well, some of the things, right, may not always be in our circle of control. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But we have autonomy and choice over our circumstances, right? You might find yourself reducing your hours, taking a break from work if you have the capacity, if it's capable, if it fits into your life, focusing your energy on what you can control. Maybe you leave the job for a while, or maybe you leave the job forever, and we have attrition in the field oftentimes because of this, right? It's an important option to consider whether the problem is resolvable at all. Some folks find and take a lot of comfort in moving roles, right, within an organization or moving organizations in general, right? Maybe what the role that you do at one place is better equipped and better supported at a different organization. These are some of the structural factors that can start to address some of that burnout. We have a colleague on our team who shared a story about this, and they said that their very wise friend once told them, what we're good at is sometimes always not necessarily what's good for us, right? And that's where we want to reflect on these kind of occupational harms. This person was very good at crisis work, but they just didn't have the training, the support from the organization to do it without a way that, sustained them or didn't harm their well-being. Ultimately, they had to stop before it stopped them, and it very nearly did. So when we talk about what we can control and the things that we are able to influence, we can see this in our control and influence circle. So speaking of that, we can see here in the middle in the green here, we have a circle of choice. So these are things that we can directly create, we can change, we can take action on, right? So maybe speaking respectfully to someone that we're supporting, right? Asking for help when you need it. Maybe administering naloxone if you have the capacity, you're capable, and you have the tools available. These are things that we are able to directly change, directly act on, right? So things that we can focus on that are within our control. Then we move to the circle of influence. So this white inner circle here, or the middle circle here. These are things that we, can have an impact on, but, can't really always guarantee the outcome of. So maybe giving your opinion on a policy, right? A workplace policy. You have a very strong opinion, but we can't always make sure that policy gets changed, right? Maybe you're offering resources to somebody who's not going to use them, right? Things that we can do, but can't really influence the outcome of. And then at the end, this final kind of green circle here is this circle of concern. So these are things that you really care about, but you can't change. So things like maybe somebody makes a decision with their life that we don't agree with, right? We can see it's hurting that person. Maybe, there is a significant policy change that we, can't do anything about. Maybe there's closures of services, right? Things that we care very deeply about, but we don't have the ability to control that within our power. In the white, kind of what lives outside of here, right, is kind of the circle or the zone of no concern. So these are things that maybe we care about, maybe they concern us, right? But things that are kind of beyond our caring, like celebrity behavior or fads or trends, stuff like that. Ultimately, emphasizing that the stressors that we face oftentimes are well beyond this first green circle, right? Our circle of choice. They're oftentimes the circle of influence and majority the circle of concern. So we can see here how this can feel sometimes like a very personal failing when we're not able to respond to the situations that we're in. But it's a very complex intersecting factor, as we can see illustrated through this graphic, right? A lot of the stuff is well beyond our influence and control, and that can make us, feel these stressors like burnout. So when we talk about risk factors for occupational harms, risk factors for burnout, we can see this specifically when we talk about peer and frontline work, that there are many, many, many structural factors, but not just structural factors. There's personal factors, and there's also workplace stressors, right? You can shout them out. Who has an example of a structural factor, something that's a risk factor for burnout? Not a clear policy and procedure, exactly, right? When we're expected to act in ways that we don't have the knowledge to do so. Exactly. Yep. Anyone else? Lack of unions, right? Where we don't have our workers' rights protected. Yeah, I like that. What about a personal risk factor? Maybe family problems. I heard one back there. Multiple jobs, exactly, right? The financial burden, our own mental health. Maybe we're dealing with intergenerational trauma, right? We have lots and lots of intersecting factors here. So we can see this in underfunded health systems, right? No policies, socioeconomic inequities that are facing us in the structural. When we move to the personal, right? Pre-existing conditions, the perfectionism, this responsibility that a lot of us will tend to take on in this work, where if we just care our way out of it, right, we'll be fine. I have been guilty of that time and time again. Ultimately, it's ended me up in the same place, burnt out, where I'm finding myself thinking, I care so much about this work. How am I always ending up feeling like this? An example that's very intersecting, right? So we might have a frontline worker with a personal history of trauma. So there's the personal, right? In an underfunded agency, so there's the structural, who faces chronic understaffing and no debrief at work, right? So there's that workplace. This individual in this situation will be at a compounded risk for burnout, moral distress, and mental health strain. These are some of the things that us as peers and frontline workers can face. So I want you to think to yourself, are you less patient than when you started this role? If so, it might be empathetic strain or compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is when we might find ourselves having lots of patience at work, but then no patience at home, right? Maybe we avoid, we minimize, we shut down interactions. Maybe you tend to make it everyone else's problem, right? These are things that can happen when there's a difference between the first time we've helped somebody, the 10th time we've helped somebody, and the 100th time we've helped somebody, right? Especially when we're working in the system where we have all of these intersecting risk factors, often beyond our personal control. Empathetic strain reflects that it's hard work, right? Not the lack of energy that is making us feel drained. Compassion fatigue is, compassion in general is care, plus the desire to act a lot of the time, right? Whereas empathy is more of that feeling. We're putting ourselves in others' shoes so much that it hurts sometimes. We find ourselves imagining ourselves or our loved ones in these same situations that we're dealing with. And no matter how much we care, no matter how much we give, it can be never enough. This can make us feel like we are failing. Again, a personal accountability for structural failings. It may not be enough to fix it, which can drain us further. So this is the invitation that we would invite folks to reflect on, right? Is, are you taking responsibility for structural failures? When compassion isn't accessible to us, we can tune out, avoid conversations that we need to be involved in, drop work tasks, right? Maybe we start to be more judgmental. We're judging other people's struggles or the way that they are dealing with their addiction, their journey, their lives, right? On the other hand, we can turn on each other, our families, our organizations, our coworkers, right? We can have this type of lateral violence in the workplace where we all care, we all know we're here to care, but there's got to be somebody to take some of the blame, right? When it's an imaginable structural factor that's beyond our control. So what are some of the things that can help, right? So personal practices that can help with empathetic strain. Resting and refueling, right? So these are some of these basic practices that if we don't have the time to do some of these larger tools, like going to therapy, working on these structural factors beyond our control, that we can do within ourselves. So making sure that you're staying hydrated, right? That you're eating during the day. Having these healthy and consistent boundaries. We're going to talk about boundaries a little bit further on, but they're incredibly important to maintaining your longevity in this workforce. So I want you guys to think about things that might work for you to help transition your brain out of that, mode of, I'm always caring, there's a failure here, to, okay, I care enough, there is a failure here, but it's not my fault. there are system barriers to empathy, right? And how we can help to manage that empathetic strain. Systemically, if these are the things that are really weighing on us, we can try to reduce our unmanageable workload, right? Again, not always possible. We can invest in the community services and support. So some of these more therapeutic interventions, DBT, CBT, right? These are things that can really be very helpful, but they do come with a barrier, right? A lot of that stuff comes with barriers. If we're in a leadership or employment setting, we are able to offer on-the-job debrief, support, celebrating wins, right? These are things that can help to create an environment where burnout, occupational hazards, empathetic strain, vicarious trauma, which we're going to talk about next, are minimized for the effect that it will have on you dealing with it alone in the workplace. Speaking of traumatic stress, oftentimes, compassion fatigue and empathetic strain will show up first, right? That sense of being drained or feeling done, right? And we keep working in the systems that don't support us and maybe don't support some of these goals that we want. We can start to mistake the systemic problems for personal ones. When fatigue starts to deepen, this is when we can turn into traumatic stress or even vicarious trauma. We're not just witnessing the trauma anymore, we're holding it. If folks have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives, especially in childhood, or experienced intergenerational trauma, we might be more at risk, right? We might be inexperienced, insufficiently trained, unsupported at work. These are all risk factors for us leading to develop traumatic stress or traumatic strain injury. We might feel scared, checked out. We can't relax when the situation even calls for it, right? Hypervigilance. These are some of the really big burnout risk factors that can happen when we're dealing in this kind of peer and frontline work. So, actually, I'll go back here. What can make it worse? What can make traumatic stress work? And how can this change the way that we live our lives, right? We talked about hypervigilance and kind of what can make things work. I'll give you an example of my own. Because I work in an overdose prevention site, I always count my friends, my partner, everybody's respiratory rate. It's just something I cannot help but not do anymore. If I see somebody pass out at a party, I'm like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. Okay, you're good, right? But I'm going to come back. I'm going to circle back. I just can't not do it anymore. It's something that lives within me. There are lots of things like this that will eventually start to erode away at us and change the way that we live our lives due to these types of workplace stressors. So things that can make it worse, right, is having our skills and knowledge dismissed, especially as peers and frontline workers, folks that are doing the hard work, that are doing these life-saving interventions. When we don't have our expertise recognized as oftentimes experts in what we're doing, that can really lead to the attrition and that burnout that we're talking about. So, moral distress, right? What is moral distress? There's a prevailing myth that when we do this work, we've signed up for all the hard parts willingly, right? And that we signed up for it. You chose to be a frontline worker, a social worker, a peer. You chose to do the work, and these are the risks that come with it. This can be incredibly damaging to our own ability to validate our own experiences and to receive the support that's vital for continuing to do this work, right? Compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are often about the emotional weight of the things that we're carrying. Moral distress is going to go ahead and take that one step further, right? It's about what we can't do. This is that kind of gut level tension that, it's that tension between your values and the realities of the systems that we work in, right? You might know exactly what a person needs. That person might be able to communicate to you exactly what they need, but we're unable to do it. We are not able to work within the system or within the resources that we have available to us, even though we know what it would take. Moral distress ultimately is the pain of knowing the right thing to do, but being unable to do that. Some examples of moral distress, right? For me personally, lack of safe supply, that's a big one, right? The closure of safe consumption sites. I'm from Alberta. It's a tough climate out there right now for services in general and the funding. We might face systemic oppression, right? Things like racism, colonialism, classism, homophobia, transphobia. These things that we can't eliminate by our own individual good actions, things that will weigh very heavily on us, but we know what was required to combat them. We just simply cannot do that in our capacity. So, all that being said, what might help mitigate that? Well, things that can help is training, right? Skill development, being in places where our voices are valued and heard, our expertise as peers, as frontline workers, as the folks that are responding to this crisis is being valued and uplifted, right? Practices that will help us to process the trauma, process the stress, right? We opened with that exercise. This is a somatic practice that can help even just a little bit in flipping your lid back to regulation. We're going to talk about flipping our lids here in a second and a little bit of brain science. Ultimately, there's a graphic here on the screen, and it's from a film called Love in the Time of Fentanyl. Has anyone seen it here? Yeah, I see a few head nods. It's a phenomenal film. It's by director Colin Ashke, and it's about a group of people who operate an opioid poisoning site. It's a safe injection site in the downtown east side of Vancouver. Really, what I like about this is it's an incredible look at the inspiring and heartbreaking work that the OPS does in the toxic drug crisis, despite a lot of these structural factors that are weighing down on them, right? It shows the strength of the team. They support each other and their community through this, beginning with opening work debrief circles, honoring and grieving folks that they've lost and that they work with, celebrations, laughs, and that kind of mutual support and some of the suffering that can come along with it. You can watch this for free at Canopy or with a library card, and I would encourage everyone to check it out because these are kind of the stories that can make us have that little seed of hope again. And these are things that we're going to talk about later on are known as vicarious growth. So things that we can take from situations that are hard to lead us to a place of a little bit of, a flipped outcome or a flipped viewpoint on it. Speaking of which, it leads us here to vicarious growth. Moral distress is heavy, right? In the sense of we know what we can't do what's right. But the fact that we feel that means that our compassion is alive. I have thought to myself, I'm burned out. I don't care about this work anymore. And I'm crying about it. Well, obviously the fact that I'm crying about it is indicating to me that the passion is still there. I'm hurt. I'm upset over the state of the things right now, the people that I work with, the folks that I'm seeing experience this, right? Vicarious growth, also sometimes called vicarious resilience, is when a peer or frontline worker experiences growth due to witnessing the tenacity of the folks that we work with, right? Their resistance, their resilience, the folks that we're helping will show us these types of scenarios that we are, witness to. Vicarious growth or vicarious resilience requires this paying attention on purpose, right? It can happen whether we're paying attention or not. For example, right, somebody might be telling you a story of the person that they supported and how inspiring it was. And they feel that they're debriefing, but you might see in there, hey, I can tell here, this is very strengths-based, and maybe there's a little bit of vicarious growth in here. Maybe, sharing the stories with your team about how a story impacted you. You heard something, it made you feel a certain way, you share that with your team. Ultimately, though, I bring it back to, it's really not about finding that kind of silver lining or that toxic positivity, right? It's about being able to hold complex and contrasting thoughts at once. Terrible things happen. They do happen. They will happen. There are also uplifting lessons, moments, elders, memories, ceremonies, right? Things that we can take forward with us that will change us. And it's about that balance, that being able to hold those contradicting thoughts. One doesn't eliminate the other. Ultimately, I'll end this module off here with, don't fall for these myths. We don't care enough. We've lost our kindness forever. You feel this way, and this is how you're going to feel for the rest of your life, right? None of this is true, and none of the occupational harms that we've talked about in this module affect us for any of these reasons. These myths and the stigma that attaches to them only serves to buy into the status quo if we believe them. When we start to deconstruct these and think, no, these aren't true, and this is not the reason why I'm feeling this way or experiencing these things, is when we can start to have some of that mental resilience and that mental growth start to happen. So that's our topic 1. Is there any questions before we move on? Right. I love that. That's a really great question. And I think that really reflects a lot of the work that we're doing and the nature of this kind of crisis. Ultimately, when we talk about vicarious growth, it's really kind of that personal effect that it has on you. So in times of crisis or in times where we may not ever know the outcome, right? Things where we shut the ambulance doors and we're expected to move on to the next, right? Where we can sit back after, and we don't have to do this at the moment, right? These are things that can be reflective of us. And we think, okay, well, in that scenario, maybe all that person could do in that moment was hold on to life, right? And that's something where we say, wow, hey, I know this person. They've experienced maybe multiple poisonings by now. And it's really impressive to me that this is the point that they're at and they're still getting up and coming back here and being, a light in the community the next day. I think it's ultimately about these personal experiences and kind of where our vicarious growth is going to come from that. Because ultimately, right, you might hear a story and think, great for you. I'm so glad that happened for you, right? It's kind of about where you feel that reflection, where you can get to that point of light. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll move into module 2 here. So these are tools for self-reflection. So we're going to talk about gaining some strategies to check in with yourself and why this is so important. This isn't just like a cookie cutter, like make sure you're taking care of yourself and checking in with yourself. We'll talk about self-care plans at the end, but I will be the first to admit I have been a huge hater of self-care plans. When I graduated from social work school, I just felt like they were like, it was, a tool that folks were giving in the classroom. And then when I got into the workforce, really not a lot of it was executed, especially in a crisis setting. And ultimately it felt like kind of a way to be like, take care of yourself, right? And I didn't really know what it meant. And so when I started to dig into it more, it's less about the bubble baths, the tea, this kind of stuff. And that may be very valid for you, but it's more about some of these practices that can help us to be reflective within and where we're feeling. Ultimately, this self-reflection is going to help us to have more compassion for ourselves and more compassion for others and holding the work that they do. So we're going to open again with the grounding practice here. So I want everyone to make a long, slow circle with their neck. You might look around the room, notice what you see. Notice what you smell. Notice what you're feeling. Are there colors or textures, words that are jumping out to you? Long inhale, long exhale. And I want you to take a second and just reflect. Do you feel more present than you did a moment ago when I was talking? This is one of those kind of minor tools, right? That it's definitely not going to fix everything, but it's a tool where maybe, like we're talking about, we're in a crisis environment. We're going back to back to back. We don't have the time as much as we'd like to debrief or have this support. We can do a practice like this that at least brings us back to a place where we're not in crisis. Our lids aren't flipped. We're able to say, okay, this is really tough. I'm having a tough time right now. How do I get to a place where I just feel a little bit more regulated? Exercises like this, somatic healing practices can help with that. It leads us to this little graph here that we have. So this is a way of checking in with ourselves. It is, not meant to be an exercise for self-judgment. But on one end, right, we find ourselves maybe sitting in this, section of the circle where we're at disconnection. Maybe you are bringing negativity to the interactions you have, right? Maybe you feel very overwhelmed and you're shutting down. You might have some cynicism, right? Maybe you've gone numb. You're avoiding these conversations. Or if you do, you're checked out in general, right? On the other hand, we might be way too involved, enmeshment, right? So you feel everybody's experiences as though they're yours. You're taking on every single one of these mental challenges, these loads, these experiences, and carrying them with us. Maybe you're over-functioning, right? Ultimately, we might not be doing what we're supposed to be doing in our roles if we're way out of balance on either side of this. It's a question to ask ourselves, where are we at today on this continuum, right? Not a source of judgment, but maybe we are feeling this disconnection, or maybe we're taking on a lot, right? And how is this going to create a risk factor for us to feel burnt out in a while if we keep going out of the swing of things? So what do you guys think? What percentage of people in Canada struggle with mental health but won't seek help? 60%. Damn, you guys are out here clocking me on the spot. Okay, I love that though, because it shows an informed audience. But yes, you're exactly right. The average population in Canada is that struggle to seek help with their mental health problems, 60%, right? This is the average statistic population. And what we know about statistics is that oftentimes they're underrepresented, right? So we can assume that this is probably higher. And then we can assume that when it comes to peers and frontline workers and the things that we contend with as our roles in that nature, it's possibly higher, right? It is very likely higher than 60% who don't seek help for their, feelings of, mental unwellness. I have been included in this statistic myself. I have been known to say, I'm fine. I'm doing totally fine. And there's tears in my eyes. My face is all red. I'm out of breath. And ultimately, there's a number of reasons, right? It might be that there's not the correct structures in place for me to be able to say that. But I would say a lot of it ultimately, and especially in my earlier life, came down to stigma. Peers and frontline workers are much less likely than the general public to ask for help. And there's a lot of reasons why, right? We have judgment from others. We have folks that don't necessarily acknowledge the expertise that comes with being in these roles. There's that self stigma, right? Or courtesy stigma. I am frequently called an enabler, especially in Alberta. Just doing harm reduction work, that's a label that's affixed onto me. And it's from early on. That was a hard thing to deal with, folks, in my everyday life when I was telling what I did, to have these really big conversations, especially when I wasn't equipped back then with what I know now. Now I'm like, let's go. I am ready to talk about that. Let's bust this puppy open. But of course, back then when I was just starting out, I knew what I felt. I knew what I felt was right. I knew what I was working and experiencing in, but it was hard to articulate that. And so that courtesy stigma oftentimes made me say, like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to come out and say, hey, I had a really hard shift today. I saw that there was somebody that didn't make it today, and that really affected me. Because like we talked about earlier, there was a lot of times where I got, well, that's what you signed up for. Like, what did you think was going to happen? This is the experiences of the role. And what are you supposed to say back to that? Like, oh yeah, that fixes it. Like, awesome, right? No. This peer role also, and the self-identification of being a peer, can impact job search, public persona, friends, right? This all can lead us to having this type of, high mental load that we're carrying. And what can happen when we're carrying a very high mental load? We can slime, as you can see on the screen, this graphic of slime here. One of the ways that peers and frontline workers oftentimes will talk to each other is through debriefing, right? Oftentimes casual versus in a formal setting, just a casual conversation of debrief, right? When we're debriefing for release or support, sometimes we might be inadvertently harming others. Slime, highly traumatic, graphic, maybe activating stories can sometimes come at us without warning and without consent. We might often find ourselves sliming people where something maybe we feel has, numbed ourselves to the stories, right? Where it's graphic, it's violent, but since we witness it all the time, we're a bit numb to that. And we then slime onto other people. There's a story from someone on our team that was talking about they were meeting with their friends after work. And everyone was talking about how someone had a hard day and it was kind of going back and forth. And they said that my colleague said, yeah, I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I interrupted with, did anybody else have somebody die today? It was silent and ultimately terrible conversationalist amongst friends. But her friends understood where she was coming from, but it harmed the conversation. It harmed those friends as she continued to then tell that very graphic story to those folks that were not prepared to hear it. And ultimately made those folks also feel like their experiences were invalid. Their hard days, their burnout that they were experiencing doesn't compare, right? How can we combat something like slime? Well, we can use a low-impact debriefing framework. This is a framework developed by François Mathieu, and it's 4 steps. So I'm going to populate them on the slide here. Essentially, it's a remedy for slime, right? The impact of slime can be secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, right? When we're hearing stories and we don't have control over what is affecting us. So a remedy for slime is to go through a debriefing process when we do feel like this is a tool that we're utilizing that helps us, but that maybe minimizes some of the more violent and graphic details. So step 1, self-awareness, right? This is what we're talking about in this module. Notice when you're sharing a story that might be upsetting to others, remembering that people have different sensitivities. Step 2, give a fair warning, right? Hey, heads up. I just had a really tough interaction. I need a debrief. It involves a client telling me something rough about their childhood, right? That way, you and that person both have an understanding, a consent understanding going into the conversation of what's about to be talked about. Step 3, get their consent. Are you okay to hear it right now? Hey, can we have a quick conversation? I really need to talk. Do you have the capacity, right? Step 4, we want to maybe do a limited disclosure. This isn't an all the time framework. This is maybe a time for when we don't have the time to do a full debrief. Maybe the other person doesn't have the capacity to hear the graphic details, but they still care about how it's affecting you. And so this is that step, right? Where don't start with the roughest details. We're gonna maybe start with the headline, how it's affecting you. This person shared a story with me about their childhood. It was very graphic and it really affected me because I see myself in that story, or because I really feel for them and now I have a big understanding of where they're coming from, right? Ultimately, when teams commit to doing an exercise like low impact debriefing, it can make it easier to debrief without feeling slimed, and also to be able to say no when you're at capacity and you just cannot hear another story today. You've got your own stuff going on. You've responded to maybe a bunch of crises. The work is taking its toll and you just cannot deal right now. And that is totally fine. In fact, that is a type of self-reflection that we're encouraging here because it's going to give you that check-in with yourself. No, I'm not okay, because we can get vicarious trauma when we're slimed and we're not ready for it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the brain science behind, if it'll move on. It seems like no. So we'll talk a little bit about the brain science behind flipping our lids. So how do you tend to respond when the heat is on? This is the question for the crew here. So it is not moving forward. So we ended off on how do you tend to respond when the heat is on? So this is a little bit about our brain science module here. So you don't have to raise your hand, but just maybe a reflection here. Maybe when things get heated, when the heat is on, do you tend to feel over-functioning, right? Maybe you take on more, you volunteer, you do the most, you maybe feel agitated and angry, but you're just trying to get through it and do your job and, help the folks that we're helping. Maybe you feel impatient, right? Even though we've signed up to do it, you might feel impatient with the scenarios, with the structural factors, right? With your workplace stressors. Maybe you go the other way, right? Maybe you tend to check out, get quiet, reserved. For me, a big one, sleep, right? My friends and family know about me that if I'm not doing well, I'm gonna come home from work and I'm immediately like, I'm going to bed. Like, I'll see you for my shift tomorrow. Is that great for me? No, not great. And ultimately, it was one of the points I had to get to realize here, if I'm in a situation where I'm finding myself coming home 5 days a week, going to bed at 6 p.m., there's probably something not going on great with me, right? And I'm gonna have to do some of these tools to right the compass back. Exposure to trauma, chronic stress, brain injury, right? These things can make it harder to keep our upstairs brain in control. That trauma and fear will hijack our logical brain. The logic goes out and the survival mechanisms go in, and the difference between the shift of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. What happens and what helps will depend on how your lid is flipped when it's flipped. We've got this little graphic here. So we've got a window of tolerance. Inside the window of tolerance is how we act when things are normal, right? This is our normal. We are acting, maybe we're responding with compassion and care. We're being thoughtful. Maybe we're able to not, when we experience stressors, go right to escalation, right? A window of tolerance is basically just a way of describing the state of our nervous system at any given moment. When we're within our window of tolerance, we're oftentimes intentional about our reactions and steady in the face of stressors. But it's normal to go outside of our window of tolerance or to flip our lids, right? Sometimes stressors can make us go to the top here. Escalation, hypoactivation, that sense of danger, feeling like, your heart is racing, you're looking over your shoulder maybe. We may get loud, agitated. Maybe you might even feel physically ready to fight, even though you're not a fighter. You've never found yourself in this place, right? On the other side too, sometimes stressors can make us go into the bottom, go into this hypoactivation, where we check out, we freeze, we get sleepy, we might have some brain fog, right? You might feel like you're just sleepwalking through the job or at work. When we've experienced a lot of stress and trauma, it can be easier for us to get out of our window of tolerance and then way harder for us to get back in. What helps bring us back will depend on many factors, including our own self-reflection, right? And what are some of the strategies that we're going to use to help get us back within our window of tolerance. So we have some strategies here, things that are usable, right? So within our window of tolerance, maybe on the hyperactivation side, stomping, shaking, doing some heel drops, getting some loud claps out, right? Maybe a big laugh or a big cry. Sometimes like I stand in Superman pose and just, and it's really tough, but it does make me feel a little bit better. Kind of puts me back into like, this is kind of silly. It's okay. Not the situation is silly, but just the stance. Maybe some deep breaths, right? A low impact debriefing, that safe connection, these somatic practices that we're talking about. Also, when we're maybe in that hypoactivation, maybe a good smell, something that reminds us. For me, farm dirt, right? I'm from Alberta. So maybe that's that cold water, holding ice cubes in your hands. Maybe it's a gentle movement, some breathing, or that safe connection. Ultimately, these are things that are important to consider when we're feeling overwhelmed because it demonstrates the importance of self-reflection as a tool for mental wellness. That brings us to the end of this topic. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave the questions till the end just because we lost a little bit of time here, and we're going to go straight into boundaries. So I want to hear it on a scale of 1 to 10. Where are you at today? Yeah. Oh yeah, scale of rubber ducky 1 to 10. You can hold it up. I see a 2 back here. I see a 4, yeah. Yeah. I'm seeing a 9 back there, yeah. A 6. Yeah. I'm seeing a 5. I'm seeing no hands up too. People don't even see themselves in the rubber ducky screen. Okay, there it is. 6 back there. 5, 2, yeah. Exactly. The reason that I like tools like this are because it's a low lift way of communication, right? Brings a little bit of levity to a situation when maybe things are crashing and burning, right? And all we can just do is be like, yeah, unfortunately right now I'm at a 5. And I just can't do it anymore, right? And there are many times where I found myself at a 9 and I found myself being like, I don't even know what to say right now. Something has just happened and I've experienced X amount of situation and I just can't communicate it. And there's tons and tons of graphics that look like this. But the reason I like them in kind of situations that we're working in as peers and frontline workers are, like I said, it's a low lift way of that check-in and communication. What are boundaries? Why are they hard to establish, right? Boundary is a clear limit. It's a limit that protects your well-being. It defines what's okay and how others treat you and what you take on. No shame and blame, right? Many of us struggle with this. And a lot of us have really complicated history with boundaries, right? There are structural factors, societal factors, personal factors that all can influence the reasons why sometimes holding boundaries are tough, right? Maybe we heard it before, right? Having to work more than one job, the implicitly high cost of living that we're all facing. The fact that roles in peer and frontline workers are oftentimes not compensated on the high end of the scale, right? We're oftentimes seeing the compensation being on the low end. And that's really tough because it leads us to a place where we might have to work more than one job. And this can be structural, and this can be something that we put a boundary in place that we don't have control over, right? Okay, I have a boundary, I only work one job, but maybe that's not financially reasonable. So sometimes boundaries are going to have to be flexible, but ultimately, this is where it ties back to that self-reflection is the flexibility going to hurt me longer in the long run? One we like to talk about, myths, because what do we do when we talk about myths and the reasoning and not truth behind them? We bust stigma, right? And stigma is a huge factor in the work that all of us do. So don't be fooled by these boundary myths that setting boundaries is selfish. You're mean or cold. Boundaries are just saying no. You just have to say no to everything. Boundaries are a one and done, right? I said it and that is it. And that maybe, good boundaries guarantee how people will act, right? We can never guarantee how people are going to act. All we can do is kind of set our own boundaries. Am I right? I like this quote because I think it demonstrates it, that boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Some of the reasons for wanting boundaries, especially in this work, right, might be to feel less drained, to feel less resentful, right? To feel like we have control, that circle of control, taking it back to what we talked about earlier, feeling like we're in control over the factors around us, having more energy for other parts of your life, to be in the right relationship with folks that we're supporting. Who here's heard you can't pour from an empty cup, right? Who here's heard it? Yeah, tons and tons and tons of people. Boundaries are way more nuanced than you can't pour from an empty cup, yes or no, right? This can empower us to feel control in our lives and in our mental wellness. Ultimately, too, they're way more nuanced than no, and there's tons of types of boundaries, and this is what we like to point out in this training here. There's conditional, right? Yeah, sure, okay, I can do that if I have the time at the end of the day. Contained, right? Yeah, okay, I can talk, but I only have 5 minutes. Maybe we could do low impact debriefing, right? Contextual. Yeah, normally, okay, that'd be fine. But you know what? Today, I'm just at my limit right now, and I just can't today, right? Confidential. I don't have an answer for you, but I'm here to listen if you want to talk. We have a story from someone on our team. They were working in housing, and they became aware that a resident had passed away. Their family had not yet been notified, so she wasn't able to share the information with the fellow residents. She had a duty to uphold that confidentiality for the moment because, of course, it's considered personal health information, right? Other residents, though, were coming up to her and asking, hey, what's going on? Can we have an update on the situation? So she really had to find that way to kindly, but, respectfully respond and say, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you yet, but I'm here to listen if you want to talk. She then followed up to provide information as soon as she was allowed. This is a good example of that kind of confidential boundary where we're still showing up for folks that we're working with, but also we're respecting where we're coming from. We're not putting ourselves in a situation maybe where we're breaching confidentiality, right? These are some of the times where we can look a little bit in the lines of a yes or a no on a boundary and start to think about what are some of the ways that we can uphold this that will actually be reflective of things that help for us. And that's I guess, a little bit about this slide, right? Is these healthy boundaries and self-compassion will allow us to do harm reduction work better because when we're able to show up for folks where they're at, when we're able to understand that the boundaries we have are for us, not for others, right? And sometimes they might be, I don't let others say this to me. This is what I have as my boundary for that. Ultimately, it allows us, like we're talking about, this self-compassion, these boundaries, to be more compassionate to ourselves and for the folks that we're showing up and working with. So tips for stronger boundaries, right? Things that you might do, let somebody know that it's changing. It's actually a trauma-informed approach to let folks know that something is going to be changing, right? Folks that experience trauma may need stability and consistency and reminders to feel this and to respect their boundary in this way, right? Boundaries and self-compassion go hand in hand because it may feel like our backs are up against the wall, especially when we have pressures that are facing, and weighing on the boundaries that we have. This is where that self-compassion practice can alleviate some of the tension and uncomfortable feelings that come along with setting a boundary. A self-compassion practice like this. So this is one that we have. It's a 3-step practice. Again, it's a relatively low-lift tool that you can use. It's adapted from the work of Kristen Neff. So I want you guys to think of a recent mistake that you've made. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like the worst thing ever that you could ever do. Think of something that's like a 2 or a 3. Right? For me, I'm a terrible texter. I forget to reply to my friends all the time. They are always like, hey, Julie, you alive? I'm like, yeah, I'm good, but just not responding. So for me, forgetting to respond to my best friend's text, right? So step 1, I want you to name the feeling. Name it. What is it? Embarrassment? Guilt? Feeling, like you're taking on too much? Anger, maybe? Name that feeling. Step 2. Remember how common that feeling is, right? Every single person who has ever lived has felt that feeling, has done the thing that you've done, right? This is, unfortunately for us, a lot of us are not having unique experiences in the types of feelings that we have. And that's what I would invite you to remember, right? Is that a lot of this stuff has been felt by a lot of folks. So that's step 2, right? The common humanity aspect of it all. Step 3, I want you to offer yourself the compassion that you would offer to anyone else in that situation, right? I'm a big fan of RuPaul. I really like the quote, we're all of our own biggest inner saboteurs. And I think this is especially true. We say things about ourselves that we would never let people say about us, right? And we would never say about other people. But somehow when it's coming from ourselves, we can be the world's harshest, biggest critics, right? We're allowed to tear ourselves to shreds. So this is where I want you to think about, if somebody was telling you the story, what would you say to them? right? If someone was telling you that, how would you say to them, oh, well, you forgot to respond to a text? That's life, right? Just respond, hey, sorry, forgot, right? Times when this might be helpful, maybe when we get the result that we don't want. Maybe there's a fatality, right? There's been a poisoning. When you make a mistake, right? Maybe when you don't know what to do and you're feeling guilty about not knowing what to do. You're feeling unsupported at work. Self-compassion practices ultimately aren't just about letting ourselves off the hook and being like, oh, you're good, girl. You don't need to feel bad for that, right? It's really about cultivating our capacity for kindness to ourselves, to others. Regular practice of this is going to make it more automatic so that we don't have to work through it on a 1, 2, 3 system where this is an automatic process happening in our heads. It increases our compassion for others. There's tons of research into this. We've talked about this numerous times now in this training, right? Ultimately, it's going to decrease that self-judgment and makes complex decision-making and high-stress workload way more doable. That leads us to the end of topic 3, boundaries. We're going to move into topic 4. The thing that I'll conclude on boundaries is boundaries are essential. Even if they're challenging, even though it's going to take practice, it's about protecting our well-being. Peers and frontline workers are carrying emotional labor. They're carrying the boundaries that are impacted because of stress a lot of the times. Knowing why your boundaries matter is going to make it easier to hold them. Mindful self-compassion is going to end up strengthening that practice. So this is the topic that I gave a little bit of a warning about earlier. This one, we're going to be talking about some more challenging themes. This is coming to the final kind of end of our presentation here. So we have 2 topics left. So we have grief and loss, and then we have our final tools at the end. But this one, we are going to be talking about some of the more challenging things that come along with doing helping and frontline work. So just a trigger warning for everyone out there. So I've got another breathing exercise that we like to do here. Again, relatively low lift way of breathing. There's lots of research into breathing exercises and the effect that it can have from triggering the brain and the body to move from that fight or flight back into a safer, more connected feeling or state, right? So there's a number of ways. I like this one because I think it was actually recommended by Chanel. And I think it's relatively low lift, right? Low effort. You can do it anyway, anytime you're feeling it. And you're just going to breathe in, going along with your hands, right? So breathe in, breathe out when it goes back down towards your hand. Breathe in when it comes up. Breathe out when it goes back down. So you might find yourself in the process of that. We've now taken 5 big breaths. There's a lot of research into taking 5 big breaths and the effect that it can have on flipping our lids. Ultimately, there's box breathing that people like, right? Where it's breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, breathe out for 4, and that process. There's also diaphragmatic breathing. This is one tool that I will say I do all the time. I am a sufferer of anxiety. I feel anxiety frequently. For me, one of the tools that my therapist gave me was to put my hand here on my rib cage and to breathe in as big as you can breathe in, and then breathe in as much as you can more. And then to breathe out and really stick your stomach out as much as you can. And then to do it over again. That practice alone, I can tell you, helped me way more than a lot of the other tools I had been giving, any of the self-reflection, sitting there for hours and hours and hours. Because that's one for me where I don't have time. It's a tough shift. There's things that are happening. I can go to the bathroom and say, hey, sorry guys, I really need to pee. And I'm like, in the bathroom, right? And it's something that really helps me to flip my lid back to being in a state that I can show up for people. And the next person that's coming into the OPS, I can say, hey, I'm Julie. What are you using today? What do you need? Right? And it's simply because of that. Again, is it going to fix things? Is it going to be able to really kind of combat some of the negative that can come along with responding to an opioid crisis or being a frontline worker? No, right? But ultimately, it's a tool in our toolkit. So we're going to talk about grief now. I like this photo a lot. It's from Love in the Time of Fentanyl. And I like the quote underneath it because I think it really it illuminates the reality that a lot of us face as peers and frontline workers. Grief is so prominent for us as peers and frontline workers because our roles are putting us in constant contact with trauma, loss, and suffering, right? This is an everyday reality that we're looking at, especially in our program specifically as the toxic drug crisis is getting worse, as the housing crisis is getting worse, as we're seeing folks that are more unhoused, that are hungrier, right? Then we're seeing folks that are living rough and sleeping on the streets more than we ever have before. We bear witness to deaths, overdoses, relapse, personal tragedies, right? Oftentimes forming close connections with the people that we support. Over time, these repeated exposures can add up, creating cumulative grief. And this cumulative grief can feel very, very overwhelming. It's not just personal loss either. We can feel the loss of potential, right? Loss of safety, loss of hope for those that we serve. Grief just doesn't look only because somebody has died, right? We can feel grief for a job that we know that we're going to have to leave. The system just isn't in place for us to be able to stay, but we really love the community that we're serving. We have a great relationship with the folks that we work with, right? And we can feel grief for that because it sucks. It's out of our control. And we're taking it into our control saying, okay, this is a structural factor. Something has to change. That doesn't mean we don't grieve that. Addressing grief helps peers and frontline workers stay healthy, stay resilient, stay effective while supporting others through loss, right? In this way, we want to honor HIV and AIDS advocacy groups, social movements like Black Lives Matter for paving the way and sharing the knowledge on this topic. Most of the research that we have that's come out of this has started from organizations and movements like this. They share the history of their journeys to this day. So what are some common myths about grief and loss, right? Everyone grieves the same way. This is one I hear frequently. They weren't crying, so they weren't upset, right? I didn't see that this person was acting overtly like they were grieved. They were just going on with their everyday lives. How could I have known they were grieving, right? It's a myth that everyone grieves in the same way or that we're going to be able to witness people's grief, right? There's a correct amount of time to grieve. There's a correct way. Grief is only justified when somebody's died, right? Or maybe that grief is linear. This is a big one that we hear, right? Grief being linear, as we can see in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross' model of grief, where you see anger, bargaining, denial, etc., was never meant to be a linear representation of grief. She's come out and said it was a theory, right? And when we look at it, we as a tendency in the Western culture look at things very linearly. But when we look at this outside of our own Western viewpoint, we can see very different rituals and cultures that, grieve very, very differently than this in a very non-linear way. And this is where some of these griefs and these myths can start to be pervasive, right? When we're saying there's a time period on grief, there's a way it should look. Can be ultimately very harmful when we are dealing with cumulative grief, things that are exposures day after day after day. And then we're experiencing the stigma from these myths, right? So what's helpful and what's not when you're grieving, right? Maybe some things that are helpful, being present. This photo from before actually is a memorial wall from the documentary. It's a time of the folks that they had lost to the OPS site and folks that they had lost to a drug poisoning. And they're standing there united. And of course, the grief is pervasive. The grief that we feel is always going to be there, especially when we're so connected to the work that we do. But sharing in grief and honoring it in these ways can really help to mitigate some of that. So what's not helpful, maybe? Not talking about the person we've lost. Expecting things to go back to normal at a certain interval. Expecting to be able to be in the same scenarios and settings that we were in and not be reminded of them. Me personally, I'll share a story. I was working frontline and I lost somebody to an opioid poisoning. And that person was very, very special to me. They always drank out of this specific red mug. And when I saw that mug being used by somebody else, it hit me like a truck. I had no idea why. I was serving coffee and I was like, I cannot be here. Right? Even right now, it pains me to think about this person. Ultimately for me, at the time, I had no idea why. I knew I was feeling upset. I knew I was grieving for that person, but it didn't occur to me to think about in these settings that it was going to hit me so viscerally like that. This is one of the things that we might be exposed to, especially when a lot of the time where we spend our time, at least 8 hours a day, could be in the places where we've experienced the grief. So we want to be thinking about what's helpful and what's not helpful as a personal reflection, right? And what's helpful and what's not helpful for others, right? Prescribing the path forward for others. And ultimately, kind of ties it back into grief is not linear, right? When we think about even how we see it in pop culture, it can be very harming. I think there's like an episode of The Office where it's like Michael Scott is going through this thing because I think Toby's leaving and he's going through anger and denial and bargaining and grief. And, it's shown in a very comedic way, but can also be very stigmatizing when we don't see our experiences aligning with what's going on in pop culture, right? Expecting grief to be linear invalidates what it can really feel like and pathologizes our responses and our feelings, which is not helpful to us. When we talk specifically about peers and frontline workers and our experiences with grief, everybody experiences grief and loss. The difference is we need to acknowledge the complexities and the volume that peers and frontline workers experience loss in particular. There are stats in Canada pointing to an average of 20 folks per day dying from the toxic drug poisoning crisis. From a cultural lens, right, we might experience grief in ways that are traumatic. Even the differences between Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of knowing, right? Transportation of bodies, right? Funeral rites and processions. The impact of settler colonialism on Indigenous communities in general. These colonial rules will supersede some of the basic and cultural practices, that are really helpful to a community that is grieving. Ultimately, we can see some examples here. So, disenfranchised grief, right? These are types of grief that we might experience as peers and frontline workers. So it's important for us to have this knowledge and to look out for it. We might feel, the grief is not validated by society. Maybe there is grief over a client's death or a relapse, right? It's not societally recognized. We might have anticipatory grief where we're grieving a client whose health is declining, maybe, or who's maybe at risk of an overdose, or we're grieving the loss of that person's housing, right? They've been warned, we're seeing where it's going. We don't want this for them, but we can't control their lives. We just have to show up where we're at. So we can see that in anticipatory grief. We have traumatic grief, right? Sudden, violent, oftentimes preventable losses. So this is a big one for overdoses, right? Drug poisonings. Maybe somebody dies from the toxic drug supply and it's leaving the worker shocked. You had a meeting with that person in the morning and they're gone, right? We also might experience ambiguous loss where someone is physically or emotionally absent, but the outcome is unknown, right? This could happen maybe with brain damage. We also see this happen in the epidemic right now that's facing Canada, the missing and murdered Indigenous women. A lot of folks that are, families of missing and murdered Indigenous women experience this, and that's this ambiguous loss. The final one here, complex grief, right? So something that we've been talking about, it's going to compound over time. These are the multiple kind of losses that make, that happen in a short period that lead us to maybe being in a crisis. Ultimately, the reason that I want to point these out is that there's multiple facets to illustrate the point that grief is multifaceted, right? It's complex. It can be hard to understand. It can be hard to reckon with, given all of these influences, but especially as peers and frontline workers who are more frequently exposed to incidences that can lead us to have grief that looks like these. So what we're going to talk about now are some ways to ease the feelings that accompany grief. We're going to start and end here with 2 tools. So the first one we have is sharing circles, right? Offering support to others without problem solving, listening without offering advice, right? You might do a low impact debriefing. You might, follow the steps on the slide here and, decide some rules, go into things about honoring the person that you've lost. We won't have time to do this today in the session, obviously, but this is a practice that folks can easily take back to their teams, their communities, their friends, right? And try it out and see if it works for you. The last one we have here, this is one that I really like. Sometimes it can be really difficult to process gratitude and joy, especially in the face of complex grief. I really like, it's a good reminder that considering one thing can sometimes be enough to shift how we feel, even just momentarily, right? I like this slide because it has a grounding exercise, but it also has an image of fireweed in the background. It's a little bit hard to see, but fireweed thrives after a wildfire. Noticing the beauty doesn't take away from the destructiveness of the wildfire. Both things can be true at once, right? I like this exercise because I think it's very reflective of sometimes the complex feelings that we might have, and it ties into vicarious growth and vicarious resilience. So step 1, right? You are going to find some space, find a little time to reflect on it. Step 2, take a few deep breaths. Notice what comes up when you think of that person. Have that person in your mind. What's the situation that's popping up for you? What are the feelings that are coming forward? You then might reflect on their impact on your life. Maybe you can write it in a journal. You can say it out loud. You can talk to your teammate about it. But ultimately, what we want to then have is maybe some of these prompts, right? Because of you, I understand what showing up no matter what looks like. Because of you, I will always try to be kind to people that I meet on the first go because somebody was kind to me as a worker on my first day, right? Because of you, I will always hope for reconnection with family for others because I saw what a positive impact it had on your life, right? These are the ways that we can start to think about vicarious growth and vicarious resilience when we're dealing with something like complex grief. Finally, you can close a reflection, right? You can, carry that forward, the statement that we're going to have. It's relatively, short. It can be a one-liner, and it's just something that can ground us when we're feeling maybe overwhelmed with some of the grief. That's going to lead us into our final topic today, and then we're going to come to the end here for some questions. So our topic here is practical strategies for surviving and thriving. These are some tools that you're going to leave with here today that are going to allow you to recognize maybe when you're feeling upset, when you're feeling unwell, and how to maybe have some, tools for mental wellness and mental resilience. I have the first one here. Finding your glimmers. So what is a glimmer? We talked about it a little bit earlier. Glimmers are like a sense smell. So I guess not necessarily a smell, but like a sense feeling, right? There are memories that bring you comfort or recall of maybe a time that you felt safety. It's not just about thinking of the thing, but trying to kind of conjure up the feelings that go along with it, right? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? It's originally a concept from a somatic trainer who interprets the work of the Polyvagal Institute, so a body and brain science healing institute. Some examples of glimmers from our team, right? Fresh laundry, you see mine, rain, dirt, eucalyptus, morning bread, a cat purring. I've heard there's like some anecdotal research, I think, on like cats purring on laying on you is like healing, and the frequencies. I'm choosing to believe that and not looking into it further. Glimmers are ultimately the opposite of triggers, right? They're things that create safety and bring you home to yourself. The reason why this is important, right, is it's a point of finding our calm and finding what can bring us back, even just momentarily, right, to a point of regulation. Routines, habits, things that are just keeping us going, right? So not necessarily only glimmers, but getting into maybe every time I come home, I have a routine. I put my hair up and I lay on the couch, and this helps me transition, right? These are things that will start to help in finding our calm when we're maybe experiencing some of these traumatic, events. Ultimately, we want to be acknowledging our feelings, right? To name it is to tame it. How are you going to transition this? None of these individually are going to fix it. I hate to be the one to break it to you. I think you guys already know that. Cumulatively, stuff like this can help you feel fueled, feel uplifted, and, feel more prepared to do the work that we're all doing. I'll give you an example here before we move on. For me personally, when I have a really tough shift, I've set up a little station in my basement. I got a party light off Amazon. I go downstairs, I got a shag carpet down there, and I got a golden retriever. I walk downstairs, I just lay face down on my shag carpet, and I put the party light on, and then my golden retriever comes and he won't leave me alone. And I allow myself 15 minutes, just to feel everything. And how can you be sad with a party light, right? I have been. It's possible. I'll give it that. But ultimately for me, it's not really about the party light or not feeling anything after 15 minutes, but rather it's a method of containment for myself where I know that it's a boundary of mine. I need to be able to give 100% at home and 100% at work. And how do I do that? I give myself that time period where I'm like, oh my God, I just cannot be a normal human for a second. I just need to bring myself back here and okay, it's going to be okay. And I can move forward to the next day, right? Things like that are going to help you because they're going to be personal to you and they're going to allow you to maybe flip your lid back. Ultimately, joy and moments of joy and glimmers and this kind of vicarious resilience and growth are a big point of what can carry us and our work forward and start to, lessen the turnover in this role and in these jobs. I like this quote because I think that it really illuminates the final exercise that we're going to do here. It's called our peak moment exercise, and it's about a moment of joy and finding that moment. This exercise is actually what our training was built on. It is our exercise that allows folks to check in with themselves and find a moment where they're at, and kind of move forward with a mental North Star. It's a bit of a complicated process. We're going to go through it. But ultimately, what we're doing here is reverse engineering for a mental state. This is one of the coolest tools I have ever seen. So I love teaching it. Oftentimes, for various reasons, people don't reach out for help. Even when they do, identifying and naming your needs can be especially difficult, right? It takes a lot of emotional labor to reach out for help, let alone taking the time to identify and explain to somebody what you need. I want you to think the last time somebody said, are you doing okay? And you were like, maybe I'm not doing okay. But you were like, yeah, I'm okay. And they were like, oh, okay, that was kind of weird. Or maybe you're like, you know what? No, I'm not okay. And they're like, oh, what can I do to help? And then I don't know, for me personally, I'm standing there like a deer in the headlights going, that's a great question. Like, I'm good. It's okay. I'll be fine, right? Ultimately, what would really be helpful, so we're not sat there spinning our tires, is that we know what's going to help before we need it. And this is going to help us with that. So our best bet to overcome these barriers is to think about what we need listed out in the first place. It might be a little different from the stuff that you've done before. Step one, define your peak moment, right? So I want you to think about a time that you felt at ease, that you felt joy. Maybe it was a memory, an accomplishment, right? Something, I ran a 5K and, I didn't think I could do it. Maybe someone told me how much it meant to me to that I was helping them, right? Could be just a personal memory with your parents, golfing with my dad, baking with my mom. For me, spending time with my sister, right? Could be ceremony. You can do this with a partner or you can do this on your own. But I want you to find that moment. Think about that moment. Step two. We're going to describe your peak moments. This is where the partner or yourself will come in handy. So your role as the speaker, if you're describing your peak moment, is to describe everything as you've heard it, everything as you've witnessed it. Use verbs, use adjectives, describe it in excruciating detail. I felt this because of this. I felt really accomplished because when I felt the 5K, I heard the clapping and I knew I had done something awesome, right? I've never ran a 5K. I wouldn't know, but that's an example. Ultimately, you're going to be detailing this experience. The role of the listener is to write down what you're saying. Be very detailed. Write down every verb, adjective. If you hear the person say things more than once, it's probably indicative that it's very meaningful to that story, right? What you're left with at the end of this is you have a list of verbs, words, actions, adjectives, things that allow you to populate our workflow, which we're going to move to. Ultimately, this also is a handout. We're going through it fast because we're running out of time here. But if you have any questions, again, feel free to email us. I'll be happy to go with you through it on a one-on-one. But this is the role. If you're doing this on your own, all you're going to do is act as your own speaker and listener. So you're going to think of your peak moment. You're going to record yourself. You're going to describe the peak moment. You're going to walk away. You're going to come back and maybe watch your recording, and you're going to act as your own listener. At the end of this, what you're going to have is a large list of adjectives and verbs. So we're going to move into building this workflow. So this is what it looks like. We're going to build this now. So you can see here there's 3 columns or 4 columns. So we have the peak moment, and then we have emotions, and then we have evidence, and then we have actions. This is what I meant by reverse engineering for a mental state. So what we're going to do, the first column here, peak moment, this is just what the moment was, right? I went fishing with my dad. Then you're going to move to the emotions category. So look back at those words. What were the emotions that were listed there? Was it happy, accomplished, purpose, acknowledged, right? What were the emotions? This is what you're going to list in this category. Then you're going to take it one step back. What is the evidence? How do you know that, for example, you felt happy? I'm going to populate mine here. So you can see mine here, right? So the evidence. How do you know that you have felt happy? Well, for me personally, laughter, right? You can see I'm kind of a jokey type of person. So I oftentimes cope with things through humor, like being nervous presenting at a conference. So for me, when I think of my peak moment, and then I looked at what made it up, and then I moved to the evidence. So how do I know when I felt happy? Well, there was laughter. How do I laugh? What are some of the things that make me laugh, right? Watching Schitt's Creek. Inside jokes with my friends, right? How do I know I felt happy? Sometimes from touch, right? So what kind of touch makes me happy? Hugs, head massages, right? Music, right? I love music. Music is a huge coping tool for me. I listen to new albums fully. The reason that we want to have a huge list of actions at the end is because of the question that I posed to you before. Hey, are you doing okay? No, I'm not doing okay. Oh, what can I do to help? Well, maybe we can go to the record store together. Maybe I can have a hug. Maybe we can watch Schitt's Creek. Just come over and we'll sit in silence and watch it. The point of this, at the end of it, is that you have an actionable list of things that is reverse engineered to let you know it's going to make you feel good. This is what I mean by it's a little bit different than things that you might have done before. It's a tool for reflection but it's built out of your own experiences and what you know makes you happy, what you know makes you feel better. I love this exercise for that because ultimately each component builds onto the next, and this is what's meant by reverse engineering back to the point of your mental North Star, where you want to feel. It leads us here. This is our final slide here. I think there's one more after, so don't hold it to me. Hold me to that. Ultimately, what we want to be talking about in a self-care plan, I think, is probably about 5 questions. Of course, you're going to take from this training what you're going to take, and you're going to leave what you're going to leave, right? This is what I think are 5 questions that are important to ask yourself before you're in crisis. This is important, right? Because naming our needs when we're in active crisis is incredibly difficult. So when we have this written out and done beforehand, it's easier for us to get ahead of it. So question number 1, what are the key physical and emotional behaviors that allow you to recognize when you're upset or unwell, right? Do you grind your teeth? Do you clench your fists? Are you quick to anger? For me, I pick my fingernails. I go to sleep quick, right? If my fingernails are raw and red, people around me are like, oh, she's not doing too good, right? It's an indicator. That's letting people know, and it also lets myself know. If I'm picking at my nails, I'm probably feeling a little bit stressed out, right? Nobody look at my nails right now and prep for this. This is going to help guide you and your support network to recognize when you're under stress without having to ask you, right? Without having to explain. Question number 2, who are the people that you're going to contact when you need help, when you need support? Dig deep. It's always good to have depth in the bench, right? Go to go back to your thoughts and think, well, if this person maybe isn't identified in my immediate support network, how could they be included in this? What kind of friends can I, rely on if I just need a laugh, if I just need, or if I need a deep conversation, right? So I want you to think about it in that way. What are some of the activities that you can take to distract yourself from feeling suboptimally? This is where I want you guys to go back to your peak moment workflow. So this little thing that we did here. So that's where I want you to fill it in from. Go to this actions list, look at what it is, and fill your self-care plans in with that. I know if I'm feeling upset, I'm going to do X because I know it's going to help make me feel better. Question 4, what can you say to yourself to help course correct some of that negative self-talk, right? Dig deep, pull from that nasty internal dialogue, these intrusive thoughts that we have about ourselves, right? Writing down what you hear yourself say during these moments of negative criticism, and then word reversing that narrative to create a more positive assessment of yourself. Maybe you hear yourself saying, I'm dealing with so much stress at work, I should just quit before I get fired, right? And instead, maybe we say, I will develop a schedule and I will manage all my priorities because I'm a capable person and I have support, right? Oftentimes, this is going to give you the ability to counter that negative self-talk as you hear it, right? So it's not going to run wild in our heads. Question 5, this is our final question for today here. Who or what should you avoid when you're experiencing a hard time, right? Who or what is going to be less helpful? Maybe now's not the time to go back to your toxic ex or to rekindle a strained parental relationship. Maybe substances and alcohol are something you want to stay away from. Maybe it's fine, right? Ultimately, this is that final kind of tool of self-reflection. Who are the people that tend to be less supportive of you when you're in crisis? What are some of the habits that you tend to rely upon when you're managing multiple priorities? Oftentimes when people are under excessive stress is when we see self-sabotaging behaviors start to manifest themselves. Having this written out is going to help you steer into the skid, right? Instead of crashing off the side of the road. Ultimately, a self-care plan like this, the tools that we learned today, they're not a replacement for more intensive therapies or interventions. It's merely a step on the pathway back to healing. It's when we're drowning, it can be just a straw up to the surface to get a gasp of breath in. I like to end our slides here today on that everything is interconnected. If we start with one thing, it can end up impacting the others. Taking care of ourselves is vital, because the world needs all of you. Folks that are showing up to conferences like this, folks that are doing the incredible work that all of you are doing. So really, thank you all so much. Thank you for coming to this training. I'm gonna leave a mental health slides here on there. Please feel free to take the numbers. Chanel and I are gonna be sticking around for a bit. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. Hands up to all of you. Applause to you guys. Thanks, folks.